Hi, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the nervous system. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start by showing you a picture which gives you a very good idea of how the nervous system is divided. So imagine you are seeing a glass of water and you want to pick it up to drink it. So in this picture, you can see the color coding for the three separation of the nervous system. To start with, we basically going to collect data. So this is the first branch, which is sensory input. So basically, when you hear the word sensory, the common word that should come to your mind is your common senses, correct? So that would be your sense of vision, in this case as depicted, your auditory, your sense of touch, your sense of taste, right? And your sense of smell. So basically, these are your typical senses that collect data from your environment. Now, are these the only senses that are going to collect data for your body? If they are talking about, if you're talking about the external, correct. But if you're talking about internal, we also collect data internally in terms of the movement of the muscle, joints, etc. So those are referred to as visceral. And we also have something called sense of balance, which is called vestibular. And we'll go into more details about them as we go through the central nervous system PowerPoint later on. So again, data is being collected. Notice the movement of this data is toward what we identified as your brain and your spinal cord. So basically you have brain and the extension of that is your spinal cord. Now together, this is identified as central nervous system, which is known as CNS. Now, what is the job of your brain and your spinal cord as all of this data comes in? We have used the word integration. Integration basically means make sense of data. And then after you make sense of the data, you are going to do what we identify as make a decision. So brain is the main part of the body. We're working with spinal cord to create what we identify as central nervous system. And again, it's your big boss, makes the decision, makes sense of the data that's been collected. Now, finally, when the decision has been made, your brain is not the one that's going to actually do the job. It's going to send these branch out of the brain, which goes to, in this case, to your skeletal muscle, causing your skeletal muscle to contract, allowing you to drink your glass of water. Now, again, so if we're talking about this branch, it's called motor output. Think about an action, right? You're taking an action, for instance, contracting the muscle. Now, does your motor output include only the skeletal muscle? And the answer is no. You also have muscles that are identified as a smooth muscle. You also have cardiac muscles, right? So these are your other category of muscles that can basically receive signal from your brain. You also have your glands that also can receive signaling from the brain and again, change something in terms of their action. So looking at this again, three main branches: sensory data collected, integration, which is your brain and spinal cord, making sense of that data, and then you have motor output, which basically makes sense of the data. Sorry, motor output that collects the data from your brain and actually completes an action. Now, when we're looking at this again, looking at it in terms of the information, you have millions of the sensory receptors, data being collected from inside and outside, which is better known as a stimulus. Then you move on to integration, which is processing that data and then making a decision. And lastly, your brain is going to send messages to either, again, here's the key things that you want to understand because we're going to come back to it. Skeletal muscle that's voluntary, and a smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as the glands, which are identified as involuntary. So this is actually going to form additional branches of the nervous system. So when we look at the anatomical division of the brain, again, you have your brain and your spinal cord, which are identified as your central nervous system. If I ask you, what is the one word that describes the function of the central nervous system? That's integration, right? Making sense of the data, creating a motor response. Now, if, going back to the picture here, if this is my central nervous system, basically anything comes in and anything that gets out, which is your sensory and motor, will be identified as your peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system, it's the communication line. And again, it will have two main branches, which are your sensory and your motor. And these are communication line, data coming in, communication line coming in, and data going out as a sensory, sorry, as a motor. So for instance, again, these are not the big thing, but if it's going in, that's the sensory. If these lines are coming out, that would be your motor. Now, these nerves can extend from the brain or a spinal cord as a means of communication. If they're originating from the brain, we refer to them as cranial. And if they're originating from your spinal cord, they refer to as the spinal nerve. The number of nerves that are originating from the brain are 12. The original nerves that are coming from the spinal cord are 31 pairs. Now let's look at the branching of the nervous system. Again, nervous system branches to central nervous system, CNS, which is made up of brain and spinal cord, and peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which is data going in, sensory, and data coming out, which is motor. There is a secondary name for these ones. So sensory also referred to as the afferent, and motor is referred to as the efferent. So if you hear these words, it's still implying the same thing. Now, motor division of the peripheral nervous system has two branches. We mentioned that earlier. You either have what we identified as voluntary movement or involuntary. Kind of recalling, guys, voluntary movement is associated with, anybody, if you guys remember, try to say it. Voluntary would be associated with our skeletal muscle, and that branch is known as the somatic. And autonomic, which basically means self-control, is associated with your smooth muscle, with your cardiac muscle, and with your glands. Again, this is called the autonomic nervous system, which implies involuntary movement. Now, when we're talking about your autonomic nervous system, there's two main branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is better known as what we call fight or flight, which basically means it is activated by changing things in terms of your glands, your cardiac muscle contraction, and a smooth muscle contraction to help you deal with stress. But parasympathetic is opposite, is known as rest and digest. Some people may call it food coma. So this is the branch that basically is active when you are sitting down, you just had a heavy meal, your body is trying to digest what is in it. It's also when you are not excited. So you are relatively alert, but you're not overworked, you're sitting, relaxing. That's also the parasympathetic division that is active. So parasympathetic is also known as housekeeping. Again, basically making sure everything is running smoothly. Now, if there is some sort of a stress or anxiety, then your sympathetic branch kicks in, and that causes the body to, the changes in the body to help with the stressful condition. Please make sure you guys are very comfortable with this branching. I can ask you guys exam questions like, what are the two main branches of the peripheral nervous system? I can ask you, what are the two main branches of motor? What are the main differences between the two main branches of motor? That would be voluntary versus involuntary. Voluntary, which is the skeletal muscle, involuntary being the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Now, when you have the autonomic branch of the nervous system activated, either sympathetic or parasympathetic, what are some of the main differences you will notice? So Sympathetic nervous system is activated again, so what we identify as a fight or flight response. Typically, you're going to see an increase in heart rate because, again, you're dealing with a stressful condition. You are relaxing the air passageway to allow more air to move in. Again, more air means more oxygen. More oxygen means a higher capacity for your body to produce energy. And the more energy you have, the easier it is to deal with stress. Your pupils, which is the opening right at the center of your eyes, are going to dilate or open up, which allows you to create a better vision because of the extra light, and basically be more aware of your environment, making better decisions. When you are dealing with a fight or flight response, you really don't care about what is happening in your digestive system. Food digestion is not a priority if you basically are in danger of dying the next 2 seconds. Think about it that way. So activity of digestive system is limited. That includes release of digestive enzymes or actually movement of the digestive tract. And typically you are going to push more blood to the skeletal muscle system to make sure that the muscles can take the proper action and move properly. Now, if you reverse that, not fully, but in many cases, if you reverse that, you get your parasympathetic, which is, again, we wrote that as rest and digest. Or another way of saying again is housekeeping. So if everything is normal or you're coming down from a sympathetic nervous system, your main goal is to lower your heart rate back to normal basically and maintain it at normal. You don't want to have too much air basically coming in. So air passageway usually constrict to limit the airflow. Again, it doesn't mean that you will not have enough oxygen. You just kind of go back to your normal capacity and you maintain it at your normal capacity. Pupils are typically constricted when you are relaxed because, again, your goal is not to create a very sharp image. You don't want that much light in your eyes because, again, your goal is not to create the best image and be very alert or aware of your environment. Now, as the name implies, rest and digest. So in this case, digestive system is going to be highly active. You're going to send a lot of blood to your digestive system instead of a skeletal muscle. And there's a lot of digestive juices that are going to help basically digest your food. And because of the high circulation of blood to your digestive system, basically your body kind of calms down, and that's what we identify as a food coma. Now, when we look at the nervous system, one of the most important cells within the nervous systems are what we identify as neurons, nerve cells, or another name for it is nerve fibers. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So here is the structure. You have this kind of the round part of the cell, which is your cell body. So cell body is responsible for basically producing many proteins, including what we identify as neurotransmitter for the purpose of communication between neuron to neuron. This central body, again, would be your nucleus, and you will have many, many organelles in here, including your mitochondria, your endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, lysosomes, basically anything that makes your neuron work. Now, coming off of your neurons, you will have these extensions, and these many extensions coming off are your dendrites. These are identified as the receptive site of the nervous system, nervous cells or nerve cells. And basically they take the electrical impulse and move it toward the cell body. So here is electricity is started, it moves it toward the cell body. And then at the end of your cell body, you have one single long extension that ends in basically a terminal. So this long extension is your axon, and the ending of that is your axon terminal. So electrical impulse that is created by a neuron only moves in one direction, and I'm not going to go into details about this, but the electrical impulse as of right now, all you need to know is it starts with the dendrites, moves to the cell body, goes through the axon, and ends at the axon terminal. This is the direction of the electrical impulse. So a functioning neuron can only and only create the electrical impulse starting with the dendrite, going to the cell body, axon, and the axon terminal. Now, why am I even talking about the axon terminal here? If you open up the axon terminal, you will have these vesicles or pouches that are packed with the neurotransmitters that are produced inside the cell body. So these little structures that we're packing inside these are structures packed with neurotransmitters. Highlight of this slide. What is the purpose of neurotransmitters? It is used as a purpose of communication between neurons and the neighboring neurons or other parts of the body. So here's a beautiful picture of the neuron. So I like to always depict it first for you guys so you guys can do the drawing. Again, electricity in this case is moving this way, right? Dendrite, cell body, axon, axon terminal. Many dendrites, these are the receptive side. Cell body with a nucleus and organelles produce neurotransmitter. Axon is taking the electrical impulse away, which ends at the axon terminal. And the axon terminal is where you will have your neurotransmitter stored until they get released for the purpose of the neuron-neuron communication or neuron to other parts of the body communication. Highlight again, direction of the electrical impulse. That means this is really important for you guys. It collects electrical impulse, passes it to the cell body, eventually to the axon, and eventually to your axon terminal. Now, the area where one neuron is communicating with another neuron, this area, this region is called the synapse. So let's depict this. In this picture, here is the axon. Here is the axon terminal, which makes this a dendrite of the second neuron. So electrical impulse, again, I'm gonna highlight this for you guys over and over. Electrical impulse is moving in this direction, right? So this area where these two neurons are coming into contact, this is called your synapse. And the gap that is between them, this space that is between them, this gap is known as, this should sound familiar to you guys, the gap is called the synaptic cleft. So if I am, it's a beautiful picture, but I'm gonna draw it for you guys one more time, making sure everybody's comfortable with this. So here is my first neuron, kind of depicting the same thing we have drawn before. And here is my second neuron. In here, I have my neurotransmitters, right? And you have, of course, neurotransmitter in your second neuron as well. So this area, let me change my color. This area where these neurons are communicating, that's your synapse. Now, in this case, this neuron is sitting before the synapse because, again, electrical impulse is moving in that direction. So this neuron is sitting upstream from the synapse. So we call this the presynaptic neuron. Therefore, this one sits above or after the synapse. So it's called the postsynaptic neuron. Which again should kind of make sense. Pre means before, post means after. Now, the gap you see right here, the gap between these two neurons is called the synaptic cleft. What's the importance of the synaptic cleft? This is the space when you release your neurotransmitter. So if you're depicting basically when these two neurons are communicating with each other, neurotransmitters as these dots would be released into this space. Again, electrical impulse always moves from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic neuron. So same information we have right here, same depiction. Please go ahead and take a look at the YouTube video after I'm done, directly from your PowerPoint, because it does help you guys kind of visualize this a little bit better. Same concept, you have the presynaptic axon, which ends in the axon terminal, coming to the postsynaptic neuron dendrite, and the area where that communication happens is your synapse, and the gap between them would be your synaptic cleft. Now I'm going to finish up by talking about the supporting cells of your neurons. You have supporting cells of your nervous system, I should say. These are the ones that basically make sure your neurons are working fine. Another name for these are called neuroglias. Neuroglia are, their job is to make sure, again, neurons are running properly and they're not having any difficulty surviving and doing what they need to be doing. So when you look at the most common type of neurons that we have, these neurons are referred to as, the supporting cells for the neurons, they're called astrocytes. Astrocytes are important because they're considered to be the babysitters of your neurons. They are regulating the uptake of the neurotransmitters, they're regulating the uptake of the neurons, they're basically monitoring what your neurons are going to receive from their environment and from the blood vessels. If these neurons, if you look at the pictures, you can see at one extent they're connected directly to the capillary beds, which is in red, and the other extensions of them is extended to the neuron, and again, making sure that these are working well together. Now, astrocytes are identified as the most common type of neurons we have. On the other hand, what we have is your microglial cells. These are the least common type of cells that we have within our nervous system. However, their job is extremely important as they play a major role in terms of immune system. They originate from the nervous system, they originate from your blood vessels. So these are going to be the cells that basically eat or engulf any type of pathogen that has been introduced into your nervous system. Next type of supporting cells that we have is present both in peripheral nervous system, as on the sides in your sensory and motor extensions, and they're also present within your central nervous system, as in brain and spinal cord. Now, the activity of these cells is to create what we identify as insulation. If they are present inside the central nervous system, the cells that produce the insulations are known as oligodendrocytes. And if they are present within the peripheral nervous system, they're better known as Schwann cells. So different type of cells, the same function. Again, what is their function? They produce insulation around the axon, specifically only the axon of your neuron. And this insulation is better known as myelin sheath. Why do I care about insulation? Insulation is important because the main job of your neuron is to create electrical impulses, right? So if you don't have insulation, like if you have a cable that doesn't have an insulation, a lot of that electricity is going to leak out, and basically the electricity loses its conductivity. So you want to make sure that that insulation is present to prevent the leakage of electrical impulses, and therefore make sure you have a very speedy transfer of that signal. Again, please do note that these cells, even though they do the same job by creating myelin sheath, If they are within central nervous system, they're called oligodendrocytes. And if they are within your peripheral nervous system, they're called Schwann cells. Here is how they form the myelin sheath. You can see it in terms of peripheral nervous system. The structure in yellow in this picture is your axon, and Schwann cell is literally wrapping themselves around the axon of these neurons. Please do note that, again, myelin sheath is only and only around the axons of the neurons and not around the dendrites and cell body. Kind of think about myelin sheath as a formation of or wrapping a saran wrap over and over around the axon. The more wrapping you have, the farther the installation and the less leakage you will see for those neurons. Okay, so next what we're going to talk about is neuron classification. So neuron classification is based on the structure or based on the function. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, and I'm going to simplify this for you guys, even though the information is already in your slide. I'm going to take a look at them in easier division. So, one second. So, classification of the neuron based on two categories: a structure and function. So as the name structure implies, it means basically how they look like. And then the way that we classify them is number of extensions coming off of your cell body. So simplified, guys. 3 categories, and I'm going to depict them for you first, and then we can name them. Here's my cell body. Here's an extension. Here is my neuron. Here's a second scenario. Cell body, extensions. And here's the third scenario. So, one extension off of the cell body, 2 extensions out of the cell body, many extensions out of my cell body. Single extension, unipolar. Single extension, unipolar. 2 extensions, bipolar. Many extensions, multipolar. What is the most common type of neurons in terms of a structure I will see? It would be your multipolar. 99% of our neurons are multipolar. Hence, anytime I draw a neuron, I draw it based on the picture of a multipolar neuron. Now, what is my functional classification of neurons? Functional classification of the neurons is based on the direction of signal to central nervous system. So use your logic, guys. If here's my central nervous system, okay? So here's my CNS. Data can come in, data can go out. If it's coming in, it's sensory, right? Which is also known as efferent. If data is going out, it's motor or efferent. So sensory afferent, motor efferent. And what if I have a neuron that sits right between those two? Remember, between implies inter, so it's a neuron in between 2 other neurons. So this one is referred to as interneuron. Interneuron is going to be the most common, and it's fully embedded inside the central nervous system. So interneuron is 99% of the neuron. So in an exam, if I ask you, what is the most common a structural classification of the neurons, then your answer would be multipolar. If I ask you what is the most common functional classification of the neurons, then your answer would be interneurons. Here is basically what we just talked about. We have sensory, motor, interneuron, right? The three categories. Data coming in, data getting out, and then the neuron that's stuck in between those two. For sensory neuron, you have, for structural classification, you have unipolar in the middle, one extension, right? Single extension right here. Multipolar, many extensions. And bipolar is two extensions. Last thing, and I'm gonna go briefly over this, is when we talk about your neuron creating electrical impulses, this is known as a nerve impulse, which is also known as action potential. The creation of electrical impulse in a neuron has a lot to do with ion movement. More specific ion movement is sodium and potassium. So if your cell is gaining sodium, and this is really, really easy. Sodium charges is +1. Just change my color, guys. So sodium is Na+. So if sodium is coming into the cell, your cell is gaining positive charge, right? Therefore, it's becoming positive or depolarized. When the other ion, which is potassium, gets out, potassium is also K1, sorry, potassium is K+, and when potassium is moving out of the cell, your cell is becoming negative because it's what? Losing positive, and that's repolarized. And if I want to push sodium back out and potassium back in, so basically reset everything that I started with, that is using a specific type of channel called sodium-potassium channel, which again returns sodium and potassium to their original places, so the process can be repeated. So here is really basic, guys. Don't make it more complicated. What I'm showing you here is what we identify as action potential, which is the same thing as a nerve impulse, which is basically electricity. How do I create electricity? When I'm not creating an electricity, I'm at -70. When I start to add sodium into my cell, so sodium is moving in, I'm gaining positive, right? Gain of positive, so you depolarize. When you lose the positive, which is potassium moving out, this is loss of positive, then you repolarize. And then when you return everything back to the same place, so sodium going out and potassium in, then that is what we identify as your sodium-potassium pump. You go back to that -70, and that's basically allow you to repeat this whole depolarization, repolarization all over again. That is all I want you guys to know for the process of action potential. If you do have any questions, you may address them during our office hours. We will pick up this, our next lecture on central nervous system.